Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Welcome to part 2 of our lecture, A New World and Crisis. Now, as always, take a moment, jot down that lecture outline at the top, and pay particular attention to those key terms, making note that you can answer the who, what, where, when, and why. Now let's get started. Now, when we left off, we were discussing, of course, the Stamp Act, which was a needed act by the British, they thought at least, to help repay all their war debt, largely as a result of the 7 Years' War. Now, as we said, it ended in massive failure. From 1765, it was implemented. By 1766, it was rescinded because of all the violence, especially in the New England area, especially Boston. Boston's where all the troublemakers are at. But despite the fact they repealed it in 1766, Parliament still maintains two things. Number one, they need to tax the colonists, pay war debt. And number two, they have the right, the sovereign right to tax the colonists. And so in 1767, they will pass the Townshend Acts. Now, the Townshend Acts are a very tiny tax on a variety of items. Again, just some, not all items, some items. Things like sugar, things like tea, things like glass. The majority of them are cash crops. Now remember, the Stamp Act was a miserable failure. But remember, Parliament needs to get this money. So they passed the second series of taxes known as the Townshend Act. And again, these are often cash crops, a few other items here and there like glass. But to prevent a repeat of the Stamp Act. Remember, the Stamp Act problem was they used violence. And so to prevent this violence from being taken out on tax collectors, this time they decide that they're going to put troops in the colonies. So they're going to take British troops and place them in the colonies to prevent street demonstrations, violent protests. So England sends over some troops. Now, one of the problems, of course, if you remember 8th grade history, is the colonists are going to be forced to what's called quarter them or put them up in their home, these troops, which greatly angers the colonists, which is one of the reasons why in the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, it says we shall not have to quarter troops. So this time, the Townshend Acts are passed, small tax on certain items like glass, sugar, and tea. However, the colonists are still upset. They still want to protest against this, but they can't use violence this time because of the troops. And so they decide, rather than use violence, we'll adopt a different method. This time, a boycott. Basically, we will refuse to buy these products. Now, this is all well and good. It starts in 1767, and over the next 3 years, they're going to engage in this boycott. Now, before we get to its efficacy, I want to point out these colonial men made this decision, and as we're going to see, it was a pretty darn good decision. But think about what happens at home now. If you're not going to buy these things that have a tax on it, you still need some of these products, which means it usually falls on their wives at home to produce these goods they can no longer buy. So just think of the women here for a minute. But nonetheless, they don't really care about the effect on the women or the home life. Instead, these men are focused on ending the Townshend Acts. So what happens? Between 1767, when it was passed, and 1770, the British Parliament is able to raise about 21,000 pounds of tax money, about $8 million. That's not terrible. They raised about 21,000 pounds, approximately $8 million. British businesses, however, estimate they lost, because of the economic boycott, 700,000 pounds, or $300 million. So yeah, the Parliament got $8 million. British businesses lost 300 million, or 21,000 pounds gained, 700,000 pounds lost. Who's the big winners here? The colonists. They have once again sent the message they will not pay taxes. This time, however, they use economic politics, not through violence. Ultimately, British businesses will be the ones to pressure Parliament to rescind and end the Townshend Acts. And once again, England is unsuccessful to get the colonists to help pay their share for the empire. The thing is, though, one of the legacies of this was not only the failure of the British here, but by stationing troops in the colonies, they set off another big issue. Because colonists do not like having troops in their hometowns. They do not like having to house them. They don't like being patrolled constantly about what they think, what they say, and what they do. So, for example, in 1768, 4,000 British troops are stationed in Boston. These are rough customers. They're competing for jobs in a depressed, recessed economy. And these British troops are willing to take lower wages, and thus taking jobs away from local Bostonians. Needless to say, fights between the two groups are common. One such skirmish began as some young people began taunting and throwing snowballs at the British troops. Now, things were okay for a little bit. These were kids, boys will be boys, no big deal, until a few of those snowballs had rocks in the center of them. Well, in turn, in March of 1770, these soldiers were forced back to their barracks, but then someone in Boston sounded the town alarm, and the streets began to be filled with curious and confused onlookers. Now, to combat this, they brought more soldiers back from the barracks, more British soldiers, and had a standoff in the town square between these colonists who are only there because the town alarm rang. Someone rang the bell of alarm. They showed up, have no idea what's going on. These British troops had already left, but they were a little ticked off because remember, they've been pelted by rock-covered snowball-covered rocks. And again, this has been built up for almost 2 years of tension between 1768 and now 1770. And in this situation, this powder keg of a situation, we see that the colonists are taunting the troops. Again, this is a mob mentality. They begin to taunt the troops. But as a law enforcement individual, the troops need to show restraint. Remember, they have the guns. Well, in the midst of all this, someone yells, "Fire." And sure enough, on March 5th, 1770, someone yells, "Fire." Now, remember, this is a small, confined town square. There are hundreds of people here. Everyone's yelling, pushing, shouting. They're taunting these British officers. And someone does probably yell, "Fire." Now, the British troops, for their part, should not have done it. But they felt their captain, they thought they heard their captain yell, "Fire." They fired on these civilians. It killed only 5 people, which again, anyone who dies is bad. You don't want a single person to die that should not have to. And 5 civilians did die. But the newspapers called it the Boston Massacre. And for the most part, rightfully so, right? These were civilians who, yes, they were taunting, but they were shot because someone yelled "Fire." Now, in the trial that followed this, is never determined who actually said it. Obviously, the troops defend themselves, saying, "Yeah, we heard our captain say it." The captain says, "Oh." And of course, this is coined the Boston Massacre. Now, in 1770, though, despite the massacre, there also will be no attempt, however, to tax the colonists. The Townshend Acts are repealed. The Boston Massacre takes place. But 1770, the rest of the year is getting pretty good. And we're going to have relative peace now following the Boston Massacre for a few years. So 1770, no new taxes. 1771, no new taxes. 1772, no new taxes. But while things seemed to be a bit peaceful following the Boston Massacre, there was a group of New Englanders, specifically those in Boston, who began to organize and use propaganda to stir up animosity against the British, because everyone knows something is coming. Not sure when, not sure what. Most likely new taxes, maybe more troops. So they began to form and organize an organization known as the Sons of Liberty. Now remember, all this violence in the past was essentially the same tactics used by the Sons of Liberty, but now it's an organized group of propaganda, of violence, as a way to, as they see it, stand up for their rights as British citizens. Remember, they're still proudly British. And it all comes to a head in 1773. So 3 years later, 1773, we're going to see some violence again. And in 1773, England decides to try again. This time, they're going to again tax the colonists, but this time it's called the Tea Act. Now, let me explain the Tea Act to you and see if you understand what's going on here. The Tea Act is a very minuscule, tiny tax that will only be assessed on one brand of tea. Yeah, you heard that right. This is not a wholesale tax on all types of tea. No. Hear me right. It's on one brand of tea, just one. Not only that, this tiny, minuscule tax is on the brand of tea that is the cheapest tea on the market. So let me explain this to you now. The East India Trading Company was having a fire sale. They were going out of business. They were selling tea at rock bottom prices. It's the cheapest tea you can buy. And even if you buy this cheapest tea that you can buy and add that small, minuscule tea tax on it, it will still be the cheapest tea you can buy. So even if you pay this tax, you are still paying the absolute cheapest tea in the world that you can buy. But if you buy that tea and pay that tax, you are accepting that tax. You are tacitly accepting that tax and that Parliament has the right to tax you, which goes back to our slippery slope argument that began with the Stamp Act. And so the Sons of Liberty are very concerned about you colonists because they are afraid that these poor, dumb colonists, these poor people, are going to be duped by the cheapness of this tea. That they're not going to understand the larger ramification that if people buy this cheap tea, even though it's still the cheapest tea in the world, it's tacitly accepting the tax and therefore the sovereignty of Parliament. Therefore, the Sons of Liberty does not even want to tempt the colonists and give them the opportunity to be tempted to buy this tea. And so in December of 1773, at night, about 50 Sons of Liberty dress up in the greatest symbol of freedom and liberty they know, Native Americans. Yes, cultural appropriation at its finest. Yeah, I understand the irony here. The Sons of Liberty felt by dressing up as Indians, they were displaying freedom and liberty. The very same Native Americans they've kicked off their land for years and basically committed genocide against. But hey, reasons. And so in December 1773, 50 Sons of Liberty dress up as Native Americans, and they board the ship as it sat in Boston Harbor that had all this cheap tea on it that's going to be taxed. They invade the ship, and they proceed to dump the tea overboard. And of course, we all know this is the Boston Tea Party. Don't tell me that our country was founded on peaceful demonstrations and no destruction of property. because they boarded the ship, somebody else's property, and in the name of freedom and liberty, the pursuit of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, they dressed up like Indians. They boarded the boat illegally. They took this tea and dumped it overboard into Boston Harbor, i.e., someone else's property, private property, that in today's money was worth more than $4 million. I did not stutter. $4 million worth of private property damage as the Sons of Liberty dumped it into Boston Harbor. And the thing is, yeah, it was done at night, but everyone knows who did it. This is not a secret. Now, after the booze wears off the next morning, they realize, oh my gosh, what did we just do? They know there are consequences for this. You can't destroy $4 million worth of property and expect no consequence. And so the question now is not if, but when. And they know they're going to be in trouble. Now it takes, news to get back to England a little while. And then, of course, it takes a little while for the news to come back, what the consequence will be. So that was December. In January of 1774, they will finally get the consequence. And the consequence is known as the Coercive Acts of 1774. England, this is punishment for the Boston Tea Party. England calls it the Coercive Acts. They're going to coerce the colonists into obedience. Now, Bostonians, however, call this by a different name. They call them the Intolerable Acts, because what Britain is doing is intolerable, because they don't deserve it. Two sets of names on the same punishment. And I gotta give credit where credit's due here. I actually think that England was pretty smart in this punishment. Remember, they have to respond. You can't just allow this damage to take place and not respond to it. What they did, though, they focused and isolated the punishment on Boston itself. Not the colonies, Boston. Boston was the trouble. Remember, Boston's the one who had the big issue with the tax collectors, Andrew Oliver, and Thomas Hutchinson, right? They're the ones that had the issue with Sons of Liberty. They're the ones that led the economic boycott of the Townshend Acts. They're the ones that had the Boston Massacre, right? This is the problem child, Boston. So rather than punish everyone, let's just punish Boston, isolate them. And so what they're going to do is they want to isolate Boston, make an example of them. And so under the Coercive/Intolerable Acts, they will close the port of Boston. Boston Harbor is now closed for business. No ships coming in or out until Bostonians pay back all the money that was dumped, that $4 million in today's money. Now, this is a big deal because Boston is a port city. The vast majority of their economy was built on shipping. And so good luck trying to pay back this money when your number one source of income is now gone, Boston Harbor. So they're close the port of Boston, number one. Number two, England feels that the colony of Massachusetts is too democratic. And remember, they're the problem child, Massachusetts, Boston specifically. So they say is, these people here are too democratic. Every time someone gets a cold, they hold a town meeting to come up with some kind of response. In other words, they hold town meetings for every little thing. And England feels that all these town meetings, this is a problem because people vent their frustrations. Again, they're too democratic. And these frustrations can lead to organized resistance. And so England's going to limit town meetings in Massachusetts, specifically Boston, to one meeting a year. Just one. This way, you can prevent essentially that mob ganging up or organized resistance. So again, isolate Boston, close the harbor for a year, and limit meetings to one a year. Again, the goal here is clear. Single and isolate Boston. But Bostonians want all the colonies, they want to educate all the colonies about their plight. You can see the little cartoon here, and Lady Liberty has been stripped naked. She's being held down by her abusers. You see the man on the far left right here looking up her skirt, again, betraying her innocence as they're forcing tea directly down her throat. This is how Boston views the intolerable coercive acts. And they begin to use cartoons like this to highlight to other colonies, saying, no, well, we understand, we did the crime, but these acts, this is against us today. It's us today, but it's going to be you next week, New York. It's going to be you next month, Virginia. It's going to be you in 6 months, Georgia. It's us today, yeah. It's on us, but you're next. Again, the slippery slope mentality. So next year it could be you. And so they work on communicating this propaganda to the other colonies. And all the colonies decide to hold a big meeting to air and talk about these problems. Yes, they're going to hold a big meeting. I know the irony here. This is one of the things that England does not want to have happen in Massachusetts. So now they're going to hold a big meeting, all the colonies. And so in September 1774, all the colonies except Georgia, basically they felt they were a new colony. They just didn't want to get involved yet. Life is good still down there. But all the colonies except Georgia are going to meet in what is known as the First Continental Congress, September 1774, and they're going to meet in Philadelphia, which is a very big, important city at the time, and it was not in Massachusetts because, remember, one meeting per year. And basically, the goal of this meeting is to talk about how they can overcome their differences between the colonies with one another. So how can us as colonies unite? No, not about independence here. No one is talking independence. Remember, they still love King George. They still love being British. They're upset at Parliament. And most of them honestly feel that if only King George were here, he would solve the problems. They're mad at Parliament. So what they're talking here is a united response, not for independence, but a united response to the coercive, intolerable acts. And they said, you remember the time we boycotted the Townsend Acts? That was pretty good. So let's do this again. Let's boycott in order to overturn these intolerable coercive acts. And so they come up with a two-phased boycott, which is very brilliant from an economic perspective. So phase one will start in December 1st, 1774. So remember, September 1774, they meet in Philadelphia. December 1st, 1774 will begin phase one. And during phase one, the colonies will no longer import anything from England. Now, why December 1st? Well, this is 4 months later. But remember, it takes time to travel. You got to get back and explain now to the individual colonies what the plan is. And you got to give businesses time to find other avenues or other countries to get products from. Because remember, you're no longer going to import from England anymore, the mother country. So you got to find alternative sources of trade. Then phase two will begin on March 1st, 1775. On March 1st, 1775, just 4 months later, they will now no longer buy British goods. Individuals will no longer buy British goods. Why the 4-month delay here? Why not start with phase two right away? Because remember, A, you got to find other trade partners, but B, businesses already are stockpiled on British goods. If you were to implement phase two immediately, and businesses would not sell, or people would not buy British goods, businesses would have to sit on all these British-made products on their shelves, and they would be able to sell them. This would tank the economy. So again, this is a brilliant strategy, this phased approach. Because December 1st, we will no longer import British goods. March 1st, 1775, no longer buy British goods. This is a united response, a continental-wide economic boycott. Oh, yeah, and one more thing. They all agree that we should do this again. We should have a second meeting. that will take place in May of 1775 for the purpose of seeing how the economic boycott is going and if we need to adjust anything. But before they meet again for the Second Continental Congress, there will be some major flashpoints and some major events. But we'll talk about those in our next lecture. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.